Hello, everyone. Welcome to Tisk Talks. So glad that you are with us again here today for the second conversation we'll be having on this stream. I'm so glad that we were able to start things off last week with our first guest, Spoopy. And I think it's great that we had the first conversation about the Super Smash Brothers Melee community and Smash in general, where we talked about outside forces which influence our community besides what happens in game, besides what happens on screen and with the characters. And today I'm very, very glad we have a very special evening planned. So please welcome with me to the stream Dr. Kyle Nolla, also known as Dr. Piggy. I'm so glad that you're here. Welcome. How are you doing tonight?
I'm very happy to be here and being able to talk and share with the Melee community just a fraction of the stuff that I've learned over the last 5 years. So thank you for having me.
Fantastic, thank you. I'll quickly introduce you, Kyle. So you're a postdoctoral scholar at the Northwestern University. You focus on disciplines such as cognitive psychology and statistics, with research topics including but not limited to the cognitive and social processes in video game expertise acquisition. And recently, I've heard you're expanding into new fields, so I'm excited and curious about that, how that will go. But also other topics such as performance, pressure, gender, and creativity. So you're uniting a lot of very, very important topics, which are also very pertinent for this stream. So I'm very excited to have you here. And last week, someone in chat referred to you as the godmother of all of this, which refers vaguely to the research about social processes in the Smash communities, and I cannot absolutely understand why they called you that, and I wholeheartedly agree with it. And well, in the community, you're also very well known, and not just because of your research interests, but also, and I'm only mentioning this among a lot of other things, because you were so instrumental in establishing and maintaining the Code of Conduct panel until it was disbanded last year. And so this year you finished your PhD studies with the thesis that we are going to talk about today. And I'm going to read the full title because I'm such a fan of the title as well. Anxious to Play, Social and Emotional Forces That Restrict Women's Video Game Skill Development. So thank you again for joining us. And I'll start off with a rather general question. So I was curious, especially considering that you have your focus in psychological studies. How was it for you to do this research? I think you started more or less for the thesis in 2015, if I'm not mistaken, but please correct me if I'm wrong. And how did the project develop for you? How was it to study something to which you've been so close? And how did that go in general?
So there's a phrase that some researchers use, which is me search, right? That sometimes we are inspired by the things that we live or that we're interested in or that we don't understand in our own lives. And we decide to put that energy into research. And so I definitely say that what has become of my thesis is definitely me search, but it didn't start out that way. So I actually, in my undergraduate, I was in a human performance lab. So we study things like how math anxiety impacts people's ability to think about other things at the same time, how children are communicated gender stereotypes about math and science through their teachers and through their parents. So in my undergrad, I did a lot of stuff like that. Well, in my graduate work, I decided I didn't want to work with kids anymore, but I still like these questions of how we think and how we connect separate ideas and how sometimes invisible forces impact our ability to perform even basic tasks like math, right? Well, some people wouldn't call math basic, but but in grad school, I started work with an advisor on creativity because that's basically our brain bringing together so many different things at once.
Mm,
It fascinated me, and there's a lot that we don't know at the brain level about creativity.
mm,
Um, but I wanted to take some of those performance pressure ideas, take some of those, social forces ideas, and apply them to creativity. So my first year study was how does creativity function under performance pressure? So
mm,
I put students in a small experiment room, and I put a video camera on them, and I said, okay, you have a partner, and that partner has already succeeded at this task. And if you also succeed, you will both get a $10 bonus, or whatever it was.
mm,
So you just have to do these creativity word games better than the average person. And although those are very like pressure filled, and of course there was a timer running too. So while all of those are really well established as performance pressure measures in the lab, um, I think because I was at a high pressure environment like Northwestern, it was really hard to get people to believe me. So my first year study was kind of a wash. I didn't
mm,
really get performance pressure effects that I expected.
mm,
However, at the same time, I was going to Smash tournaments at my locals.
mm,
And
mhm,
I saw this environment where all these different cognitive skills, sensory motor skills are coming together, and willingly, people are willingly putting themselves under enormous amounts of pressure. And sometimes it's only your round one, right, at your local. It's not actually high stakes, but people still get nervous or still get salty when they lose. So that's how I started down this path, was sort of stumbling around, realizing that I had access to a great like natural environment that isn't well studied in psychology,
mm.
and following my heart, or following the research question, um, until we've gotten here.
Fantastic. So what I gather from what you're saying is that it complemented each other very well, the research that you did and your background and your firsthand experience
Mhm.
in the Smash and Melee community, right? Okay. Yeah, sorry.
Oh, no, just, I started out just looking at skill and creativity generally, just
Mm,
think thought patterns generally, because that isn't very well established in esports literature.
mm,
But the gender portions came when it came time for me to decide what my dissertation would be. Then I realized, you know what, this is something that's been affecting me my whole life and that I've been dancing around in my own research. So let's just do it. So
mm.
that's how I got to there. Yeah, yeah.
That's great. I was also curious to. I know that there is a growing field of esports research, especially in conjunction with psychology. But I was kind of curious to hear from you how your academic surroundings reacted to your choice of this topic and this of your research.
Mhm. Yes, so it's I kind of got lucky. I gotta say, there's a lot of advisors that would look at this topic and say, "This isn't serious enough. You're not going to be able to publish. No one's going to take you seriously. So why don't we try something else?" But my advisor at the time, he was a leading creativity researcher, and he had people tell him that about creativity. Like, oh, it's impossible to measure in the brain. You can't possibly create a lab task that expresses the whole creative process. But he did it anyway. And
Mm,
so when I approached him about this, he was more accepting than many other uh, people might be. And he said, "You know what? My kid plays video games, so I know that there's stuff
mm,
happening there, but I don't know much about video games. So as long as you're okay with me giving you general guidance instead of very field specific guidance, do it." So I did. I actually found another professor in my department who plays League. Or no, he
mm.
plays Dota. I'm sorry.
Okay.
He plays Dota on the weekends.
Mm,
Uh, so this is like, a man in his 50s with 4 kids and, a full professor. And so he and I started talking one day. He was like, "I heard you study video games." And eventually it got to the point where um, his lab studies implicit learning. So the learning that we do without thinking about it, which
mm,
actually lines up very nicely with
mm,
a lot of skill development and video
mm,
game learning. So I ended up bringing him onto the project as my secondary advisor. So there were people in my department that were like, "Ha, is this a joke?" when I first presented, or it's like, "Is this just a passion project on the side, or it's like, are you really doing this? And I was like, yeah, I'm really doing this.
Mm.
And as long as I can finish projects, and as long as I can write things up and publish them, I think in the end, that's what mattered. But yeah, there were many places where if somebody had just put their foot down and said, no, I couldn't be here.
Mm.
But I'm very lucky to,
Mm.
and grateful
Mm.
that now I have this huge body of huge data sets and a whole like research program that I can talk about gaming.
Yeah, so as it is often the case, it very much depends on how open your supervisors are, and so that's great to hear that they were supportive and actually brought in their own set of expertises, or I don't know if there's a
Yeah.
plural to that, but anyway, yeah. And the fact that you mentioned implicit learning is also already very interesting to me because I'm thinking of a different kind maybe of implicit learning, which will slowly lead us to our main topic today, I guess. But so yeah, implicit learning also in the way how we are positioned socially within our communities, right? And how our background and how our identities influence how we access the game and how we play the game and how we perform as well. And that's also one of your main points in your thesis. Um, so I'd like to, starting to talk about your thesis, I'd like to maybe pose a provocative question, which would be that, so bearing in mind, because you write in the beginning that there's a trope of equal footing in video games, right? Um, and so, but it's a double-edged sword, I take. So on the one hand, there is something like a equal, like a level playing field, and in so many other ways there isn't. And I was wondering whether you could start us off with what is actually, compared to other fields in society or to other kinds of sports, maybe what is actually equal about melee, but for that matter also other esports, and what actually isn't, and what makes a difference for the players.
Yes, of course. So if you do even a cursory review of the literature and the expertise, you're going to get a couple different fields that have been studied over and over again. One of those is music, which has a lot of parallels to melee in terms of learning a skill and performing a fine sensory motor task under performance demands, right? You're also going to read a lot about chess. So a lot of, it's a slower thought kind of thing, but it's very limited by, it's less limited by who you are. Or what I should say is, it's a game. Like melee, it's a game. You have basic inputs and outputs, and you can learn the game that way, right? And the final field you'll find a lot of expertise literature on is sports, physical, like soccer, golf, those kinds of sports. And when there's still debate about what are the roles of practice and talent in expertise or skill acquisition, right? And so for each of these different fields, music, chess, and sports, the answer is going to be slightly different, because we look at Michael Phelps of winning the Olympics. That would not have been possible if his body were shaped differently. That would not have been possible if he didn't have different enzyme catalysts and stuff like that. Like, there were physical things that he was born with that made him able to break all the records that he did in swimming. But when you look at something like music, it's a little different, right? You hear about people being born with perfect pitch. You hear about people being a musical genius. In the end, a lot of the research shows that those people just played a whole lot of music really early in their lives and kept playing it, and that's how they got so good. And then finally, when it comes to chess, some people would say, oh, some people have a mind for it, but nobody's a grandmaster without playing thousands of games. So when I was starting this field, and what I was trying to say, like, okay, what is esports in relation to all these other kinds of skills? Well, let's look at the physical. What is physical about esports? Now, I went to college with someone who was born without a left hand. And undoubtedly, she would not be able to play at the same level as everybody else, right? But the number of people that are born without a hand or born without the ability to hold a controller and input buttons is very, very small. So we can say anyone who can push buttons can play this game. But of course, I want to know a little bit more. I want to say, okay, well, aren't there brain-based differences in how the signals are sent or something like that? And so when you look at gender differences in particular, there's really not much. When you look at general working memory capacity, when you look at intelligence or G, fluid intelligence, when you look at reaction time and all those things, they all basically even out, or there are no gender differences in those skills, cognitive capacities, I should say. So even just looking at the physical side of gaming, in theory, there is nothing that should stop me from being able to reach the same skill level as an identical male version of me. People might say, I've heard before, oh, testosterone matters, but we start to get into motivation when it comes to some of those gender differences, right? It's not, testosterone does not have a direct effect on your ability to execute a combo in Melee. It doesn't. Yeah. It might have an effect on how motivated you are to beat your opponent. I'm willing to, I'm willing to say that's a possibility, but those are more indirect effects. So at its core, like chess or like music, the gender difference is negligible or non-existent in Melee. So that's kind of where I started. But I've mentioned practice and talent. There's actually, when you think about it, way more than that actually contributes to outcomes. So people's motivation, people's willingness to keep trying, people's support systems. Is your mom kicking you off the GameCube every hour because she thinks that it's rotting your brain? Social support, those sorts of things. So that's what I kind of wanted to look at in my research, was that let's start from the theoretical perspective that there's no gender difference in innate ability or something like that.
Yeah. So when you're talking about, I really like that comparison when you're talking about music and how the amount of practice comes into play and how early someone has access to this field which they're good in. And your thesis makes a lot of great points about how that access might be spread differently based on gender, for example. And what I really like is that, so I would like to continue that, because you're talking about that the gender-based differences compared to other fields are relatively small, if possibly non-existent, right? And why I actually think that your thesis is such a crucial document and such a crucial research result for others to explore is that I think that you provide really great tools with which we can actually analyze some of the disparities and discrepancies in our communities. So when you're talking about that in theory, at least, that there's not a lot of gender-based difference, and people might wonder and ask you, so if there isn't such a difference, why is it that the representation of women or gender minorities is so small in comparison in our communities? And so what's the deal with that? And I would be curious for you to expand on what your thoughts are that you also present there.
Yes. So if you go to anybody who's gone to a game tournament, looks around, sees that there's probably less than 5% women participants, competitors, or even spectators. There's very few, right? So while I say in theory there's no difference in potential, in the outcomes there's obviously been a huge difference. And so there's two ways we can look at that. We can look at the existing world as it is and say, okay, can we spot any differences between like women who game and women who don't game? Can we spot any differences between the men and women who game or the men and women who don't game? All of these different comparisons of what is out there already. And in many ways, we are limited to that approach. But the alternative approach is, okay, theoretically, what created these differences? And of course, that is also an observational approach, because you can't really know without asking. It's not really ethical to go and tell a child, you have to play 30 hours of video games for the next 10 years, and then I'll be able to publish a result about you. It's just not feasible. So, so yeah, looking both at what is and then what was are two ways that we can try to tackle this question of, okay, so why, despite the potential, is the outcome just so different? And so I had 3 studies in my thesis. One of them just looked at general skill and emotion regulation in competitors who are already, registered and entered into Smash tournaments. I looked at their anxiety levels over the course of a tournament, and their own thoughts about what emotion means in competitive contexts. So that is a lot of the okay, what is, and how might it be affecting people differently. I took a more controlled approach in the second study, which was looking in a lab setting, bringing in women who don't really game and men who don't really game, and seeing if I can manipulate this context or the circumstances to create some of the effects that we did see in real life. And then the last study is more of a retrospective survey-based thing, where I say, okay, across your lifespan and even now, how do you feel about this? What were your experiences with that esports competition, whatever it is? So I doubt we can do every little piece of data today, and that's okay. Yeah. It's like a 200-page document, so I don't expect that. But I would say that, yeah, there are different methods to be able to address this, and I'm happy to start in whatever place you want to start.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right with the fact that we unfortunately won't be able to cover the entire thesis, and that would take a few more streams, I guess. But to at least like shine like a few spotlights on certain things. And when I was talking about the tools that you bring to the table with your thesis, I was specifically thinking of the idea of stereotype threat. And I think that's a great way to approach these dynamics where there is a very perceivable discrepancy or inequality in both in the number of attendance, but also in performance, maybe. And so I was wondering whether you could. I also have a few quotes prepared, but off the top of your head, maybe whether you could provide a short insight into stereotype threat and what effect it has on different areas in a player.
So generally speaking, human brains are really good at finding patterns. We can take a limited set of inputs, a couple images, or a couple experiences, and we can draw some pretty long-term conclusions. And while that has helped our survival in many cases, there are many times where it has limited us. Specifically, when we enter a world where, maybe 4 out of 5 of the parents we've ever met who are just stay-at-home parents are stay-at-home moms, our brains start to think, okay, women must be better suited, or we fill in, we make this assumption that women are better stay-at-home moms, or women prefer it, or women should be. There's all these words you can use, but basically our brain sees a pattern. And when we pick up on this, and we get them not just from the stay-at-home moms we know, we see it on every TV show. We hear how our parents talk about somebody else who does or doesn't work, or stay-at-home parents are doing a ton of work. I don't want to, but whether or not they have a career versus staying at home. And we take all of these small little inputs and we start to construct this worldview. And that is what I would say is a stereotype. Nobody personally, a lot of people don't personally endorse a stereotype, but if every Black person you see on TV is a criminal, a stereotype begins to form. And it's not that you agree, it's just that that's what you've seen. That is what your brain is making conclusions about. So by the time you walk into a tournament and see that it's almost all dudes, you've already probably been very familiar with stereotypes about gender and gaming. And that's just something women are dealing with from day one. It already exists. And so when you walk into this place that is stereotyped to be for somebody else, right? I've never been on a party on a yacht. And if I walked up and I went to a yacht party, I would feel so out of place just because that's not my socioeconomic background, right? And I would be super aware of the fact that I'm poor or whatever relative to these yacht party people. Same thing with gender and gaming. You walk into the room, your whole life you've been told, gaming's for boys. And then you see in front of your eyes, oh, gaming does seem to be for boys. There's a process in you that you have to reconcile. You have to say, okay, does that mean I don't belong? You can say, okay, does that mean, am I going to reject the idea that I don't belong? Am I going to accept it? Am I going to fight against it? Is there something I'm missing? And all of that energy, that mental energy, you're dealing with just trying to make a decision about how you fit is something that a guy who walked into a gaming tournament doesn't have to do. And that is what stereotype threat is. It's this idea that just by who you are, you have to think and you have cognitive differences in your ability to handle the situation just because you're sitting there trying your best to cope or reconcile the reality with who you are. And so stereotype threat has been found in academic contexts. It is, and with race, with gender, with all different sorts of social categories. So not just academics, but many different performance contexts, right? So we know that stereotype threat reduces your working memory capacity. That is, you have less brain space and brain power to be able to do the thing you're there to do, whether it's a math problem or gaming. We know that stereotype threat affects your self-efficacy beliefs. So whether or not you think that you can handle what you're about to do, your confidence, your general thought that you're qualified, your competence. And a whole host of other things. So it's a stressful experience. That's why it's called stereotype threat. And that stress affects our brains. And that's one way that that I've thought about esports. Is that when I go into an esports venue and I sit down and try to play with one of my friends, there's often like 8 people that are just kind of hanging out watching us because they want to see how good the girl is. And I have to adjust my focus and my effort in a way that my guy friend that I'm playing against doesn't have to. That's the rundown.
That's like such a perfect summary. I mean, of course, but that's that provides so many answers to what I was wondering about, and I think that's also the fact that the way how you combined this approach with a very empirical study, right? So it's there. So my problem often was in the past with having like a hunch about maybe social inequality, different access to video games, to consoles. That's also something that you write about. But so little data to back it up with actual numbers, right? And that's what you did in the thesis, and I think that's why it's so instrumental. And I think that's where it starts and where it gets really interesting for me, because the fact that at events, I think nobody would think that even, let's say, men or cis men aren't subject to emotional stress while they attend these events and while they have to perform. And they have to also invest mental energy into their performance or playing process. But then there's this idea of stereotype threat, or not idea, but the fact actually of stereotype threat, which makes it somehow skewed, right? If I understand that correctly. And I would also, if you could, because you've mentioned how it impacts, for example, motivation, right? So how stereotype threat impacts motivation, how you have to watch out for confirming or not confirming certain stereotypes. And I'm also very interested in how it impacts, for example, anxiety. and how anxiety for someone who is faced with a stereotype threat is different from someone, let's say, who has to play in bracket and is maybe anxious. But what's the difference there, maybe?
That's a great question. So generally speaking, when we talk about mood or any kind of emotional experience, you talk about both valence, which is like, is it positive, is it negative, and arousal or energy levels. So how hyped up or how sleepy kind of are you, right? And the experience of anxiety specifically is not just high energy, it's also negative valence. So it's realizing, oh, there's a lot going on that I care about and I'm invested in this. And then also perceiving threat or perceiving a potential negative outcome. So I might lose to this person because we're really closely seated and I want to make it to top 64. That was my goal for this tournament. You know, that's anxiety provoking. It is, absolutely. When it comes to stereotype threat, I think one of the really important differences is there's not much you can do to change what other people think of you. If a stereotype is already in the air based on so gender is more flexible than it used to be, right? A lot of us can just decide what and adjust our lifestyle and our presentation, and our gender can be what we want it to be. But unless we have a very supportive environment, a lot of those things have to wait to adulthood. And so gender is a slightly less flexible category than, say, I don't know, you're placing in a tournament. That's not an exact parallel, but what I'm saying is you can be anxious about your upcoming game, but you still have some facet of control. You still can practice, or you can do your 10 minutes of meditation before your game, or you can check VODs and control and like see what your opponent has done in past matchups like this. Like there is still some stuff you can do to address the thing that you're fearing, the threat that you're perceiving. Whereas with stereotype threat, I'm not just going to stop being a girl in the next 10 minutes, right? And although I understand gender to be a pretty fluid category, there are some people in this world that believe that gender is extremely rigid categorization, male or female, girl or boy. And if those people are the ones watching you or commentating your match or cheering for their buddy from the sidelines, if they're going to scream something like about your genitals or something really rude about your gender, that still affects you, right? And there's nothing I can do about it in that moment. So that's a really important difference is performance anxiety absolutely affects you, absolutely affects everybody who cares about the game. It's just that when it comes to stereotypes, it's outside of my control. I can't change whether I'm black or white, and it's very unlikely that I'm going to change whether I'm a girl or a boy over the course of a tournament. So I think that's one major reason why you might have a bad game experience and come back again later, because it wasn't about who you are. But if you have a bad game experience that was about who you are, it's so much harder to bounce back because you also internalize that message that you can't change it.
Thank you. That's so insightful. I think why I'm so convinced that all of your observations are so spot on is also the fact that because now we're talking about it, and these things may sound like very abstract ideas, right? But I think it changes a lot as soon as you create these studies where you have a process which you go through, which is to some extent standardized. You have your tools, you have your methods that you apply to these studies. And then you are able to observe something like, which I found really, really interesting, the fact that you were talking about self-efficacy and how self-rating varies between different people based on their gender. And so it's so interesting for me because there might be people who have a fair amount of prejudice, and they say, well, that, for example, I don't know, women are just worse at video games. But when you take a look at how the people themselves feel and where you made the observation through your study that the self-rating in correlation with the performance, for example, is so different and so much worse for women or gender minorities compared to men who have like a more more precise self rating, if that's a correct phrase, I don't know, but have a better self-efficacy in that sense. So that's that's the self-efficacy, which the point which I found really really interesting. And
I can explain a little bit about the
yeah,
study too for anyone who hasn't read it. So this was a lab-based study in which I invited undergraduates who reported they'd never been to a Smash tournament, they'd never competed before, but they've played the game sometime in the last year. And I took all these people who are basically noobs, inexperienced, and I said, all right, all 14 of you are going to have a tournament next week. So this week we're all going to learn how to play together, and next week you'll all battle it out. They knew at the beginning that they're all bad. But the important difference here is that sometimes I ran these tournaments as women only, or anyone who identified as a woman, but in this case it was all cis women, and women or co-ed tournaments, so people who identified as men and identified as women. So this finding that we're talking about here is that the women in co-ed cohorts, they came into the tournament, they sat down next to a guy, and they played the game. And they sat down next to a girl and they played the game. And at the end of those 10 or 14 tournament matches, you know, I asked them, okay, how do you think you did compared to everybody else? For the women in the co-ed cohort, they, even when they were doing as well as the men, they rated themselves in the bottom 25% of the tournament. So even when they were actually going stock for stock, game for game, they still thought they were worse than the other people around them. The women in the co-ed tournament and the men in the, the men in the co-ed tournament and the women in the women-only tournaments, you ask them how well they did, their rating actually reflects accurately how well they did. So if they were going stock for stock, they usually say, yeah, I was average. If they were, you know, wiping the floor, they say, yeah, I did great. And so, yes, that's these beliefs that we have about our own performance, looking at asking them how they think they did, and then comparing it to their objective performance. Even just feeling like they were being compared to the category of these boys, these strangers that I don't know. Even though I told them at the beginning of the study, you are all bad at this. There's some belief in them that is leading them to think, oh, my victories don't count as much, or I'm just not as good, even if they are performing. What's also interesting is not only does this come out in their self-efficacy beliefs, or you know how confident they are, it also comes out in their anxiety levels. So at the end of the tournament, the women in the women-only cohorts, usually they had a good time. They were talking and chatting, and they leave less nervous than they came in. But the women in the co-ed tournaments, their anxiety goes up. They come into this tournament not sure what to expect, and at the end of it, they just want to leave because they're over it. It was not a positive experience, no matter how they performed. Yeah, so like you said, the fact that this was a lab study and that I could control how much video game experience these people had, how much Smash experience they had, I could control what they knew about their fellow competitors, and I could control you know, how much game time everybody had training. You know, that allows me to say something about the fact that these cohorts had these gender differences is probably what's driving these effects. Which, yeah, it's pretty powerful. And and of course, the last finding was that the women in co-ed cohorts actually performed worse. They didn't perform up to their expected potential, against men especially. So even if a woman walked in having played Smash once a month, and a man walked in having played Smash twice in the last year, she would still lose to him, which is just amazing to me.
That's I actually have a quote prepared for that, which I would like to read out soon before I make a point which is relevant to what you just said, because that's also like that was the thing about it is you can't argue with that, right? You have it there, you have the numbers, and of course I don't know, maybe as it always is in academia, you can discuss about certain methodologies and stuff like that, but at the end of the day, there isn't a difference just by the way you designed this in-lab study, which is, I have to say, just the design, just the idea of having novices play against each other with the same with the same, what is it, prerequisites, I would say, and being able to compare these figures with each other. That was like, I was so thrilled when I read through that, and so I really want to read out this particular finding. I think you were referring to that. Just have to browse through my copy that I printed
I
out.
can't believe you printed it out.
Oh, I will hang it to like, I will use a frame for it. But you, by the way, but you are going to, so you are going to publish the studies separately in different journals then, not as a book,
Yes.
right? Okay.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, maybe I'll do a book one day, but I need to get those studies out first.
for sure.
Yeah.
No, I get that. So I'd really like to just to have like a short insight into what your studies are, and to actually mention some specific numbers. So that's on page 52. And here you discuss the results of the study. And you write, regarding match by match performance outcomes, analyses of match by match data revealed that women underperformed against men at every level, right? So, and you made sure that you don't compare different players who had different access and different skill sets at the beginning. You accounted for that. So when women were the lower skilled competitor, they rarely upset higher skilled men, doing so less often than they upset higher skilled women. Okay. Even in the case of predicted ties, women lost to equally skilled men at a rate significantly greater than chance, and you are able to prove that, right? So, even when women were the highest skilled competitor, they underperformed against lower skilled men, winning only 9% of games they were projected to win. And that's exactly the thing. You can't argue with that. The across the board underperformance of women in our study suggests a strong stereotype threat. That's where we circle back. Stereotype threat effect that may be linked to the inexperience of our players. That is, stereotype threat may exert the greatest influence of players. Okay, I won't read it to the end, but you get the idea. And so this is such a great basis of having these discussions, because I will come to sort of the perspectives and where we go from here, and how we can use studies like yours to try and improve how our communities work. But first, let me actually check my notes, because I'm trying to keep track of all the interesting things that you talk about. Yeah, exactly. So, just one more point that I wanted to mention, because the self-efficacy has such a, all of these things are interrelated, right? So if the self-efficacy is worse, then this has an influence on the anxiety, right? How you handle the stress. And I think that's, to have this holistic um, view, I think is really, really important. Um, Let me check. Now I lost my trail of thought, kinda. But yeah, that was the second study in your thesis. Oh yeah, right. So that was it. And now I was wondering, because that's like a recurring topic in our communities. And when you look at such great initiatives like Smash Sisters, and in Europe we have the EU Women of Smash, I was wondering on your take on keeping your studies and the results of your studies in mind. How would you make the case for these women-only spaces or events? I would be just really interested in how you would argue for that.
Yes, and of course this is so complicated because earlier I talked about sometimes we can look at non-women gamers and compare them to women gamers. Well, results of some of my work has shown that women who or not cisgender men
Mm.
who play video games, despite all of these people telling them, oh, it's not for you or whatever, we tend to be slightly different in many different ways than women who are like, okay, yeah, maybe it isn't for me. Maybe we're more competitive. I didn't really find any results to support that, but I did find results that we're way more interested in like systems and in like analytic thinking. And I did find results that we don't identify as strongly with the label of female or woman, right? And so when you introduce an initiative into an existing community, it's not just appealing to those novices that I ran in my lab study, right? It's appealing to the women who have already been filtered through, who have already withstood all of these circumstances, and who may not identify strongly as women to begin with. So if you say, okay, let's make a girls' club and everyone comes and plays games, the people that are surviving right now might be the very same people that are like, I don't know about that. You all can do that. I'll do my thing over here, right? And there are many internet slang terms for this, whether it's pick me or whatever. I don't even think that that's the problem here. The issue is one reason we survived is that we weren't super sensitive about the label of woman stopping us. And so then to draw attention to the label of woman, for some people can be insulting. I don't find it insulting, but it is something that a lot of women in gaming go through, is that they have to get over this idea that like they're different from other girls, or that they're the label of girl doesn't apply to them, whatever. So in practice, I think these women-only spaces, obviously for newcomers, are super powerful. That's what that study was for me. Is like, if we're going to recruit people, if we're going to like welcome people into gaming, somebody who like thinks the game looks cool but like has no idea about a lot of the competitive aspects or doesn't even know how to start, those women-only spaces are crucial. But the study that I haven't done yet that I would really love to do is showing that events like the EU Women of Smash or Smash Sisters are also really important for those of us in these spaces, because they provide a place where you aren't being exposed to stereotype threat in quite the same way. So, you know, you like Smash Sisters is still streamed, it's still recorded, it's still commentated, it's still a pretty high pressure event. But what's interesting is that it's not one-on-one, right? It's not like you're trying to find out who's the best girl. And there's no cash prize. So that's also taking, you know, it's not saying like, oh, we're going to incentivize people by giving them more money, right? It's about, let's play this game together. Let's meet each other. Let's support each other. These people, these other people that might have similar experiences. So my experiences with Smash Sisters, even though I'm not great at the game, have always been super positive and made me appreciate that, like, I am as competitive as the guys, even if I get scared when, or you know, even if I get really nervous when I play a high ranking dude or whatever. Like, there is all that within me. I can just get just as salty. I can get just as invested. I can cheer just as hard when it's my gal pal, right? Yes, so I think these spaces are really important for, first of all, recruitment of new people, but especially retaining. But there are so many different ways that it can go wrong. So not that long ago, I think a month or two ago on Twitter, there was some tournament with like a big cash prize pool that like the highest performing woman in this tournament will get this amount of money. And there was a lot of lashback, right? Because it was externalizing or like, you know, people have different opinions on things like affirmative action. And I do think, for example, like at a college level, offering scholarships to just this racial minority group or just sons of firefighters, I don't know, you know, I think we can all understand why like college is just so darn expensive. You take what you can get. But when it comes to a cash prize that's rewarding you for being the best girl in the tournament, that starts to inch into territory of comparisons, one-on-one comparisons. And there's few enough of us as it is. I think we should really uplift and celebrate each other at whatever opportunity we can. So I think it's not horrible in theory to provide like extra cash prize for the women, but in practice it turned out to totally fall flat. So this issue is always going to be complex, but we need to keep trying. We need to keep offering that. You know, I also like the idea of, you know, offering tournaments for minors, like minors only, or is that really so different from the Arcadians we already run, right? So Yeah, I think just remembering that having like an all open bracket doesn't necessarily mean everyone's walking on equal footing. Um,
Yeah.
can help TOs prioritize. Okay, so maybe I should make sure that the people who aren't walking on equal footing have opportunities to play as well.
I'm you mentioned such powerful ideas right now, and I want to really get to discuss more of them in more detail. So I think the example that you brought up with the cash prize, I think that's like a really good example of how wrong you can go. It just entirely misses the point. And I can perfectly see why you think that. And um, if I understood you correctly, the advantage of having these women only spaces or events, because you do say that the point is not to indefinitely isolate one from each other, right? But instead, during these events, build up certain resources, certain motivational forces, or and we'll get to that hopefully when it comes to emotional regulation. Um, or emotion regulation. No, it's emotion regulation, right? Sorry. I'm sorry
Yeah,
about
yeah,
that.
you're fine.
And because I'm trying to transition a bit into the possible perspectives and the potentials and what we do with the results of your studies and with the data. And so and I was thinking about, because it does seem like a very bad cycle that we're kind of trapped in, right? So where there's this discrepancy between men and women and gender minorities and how many attend events, and thereby reinforcing like stereotypes or stereotype threats, I should say. And so I was wondering how to break out of that. And I do think that like the way how you framed it, the things like Smash Sisters is a great start, at least. And also talking about these things and reframing the conversation and trying to look out for actually empirical explanations for the problems that we have. Um, so I was wondering whether maybe also, because I do think that the way you wrote about emotion regulation, that this concept proves to have like a great potential how to work on certain things. And I was wondering, do you think that it should be applied in how we confront social inequality, for example, when it comes to emotion regulation? Yeah.
Okay, so generally speaking, self-regulation is adjusting your own behavior to reach your goals. Um, and that goal might be, I don't know, happiness or stability, or it could be becoming top 100, whatever. So there are many different facets of self-regulation, but one of them is emotion regulation. So specifically, when you have an emotion, how do you deal with it? Do you deal with it? Do you try to stuff it away? Do you try to think through it? Um, yes, so that's what emotion regulation is. It's like adjusting your own emotional response towards a desired outcome. And sometimes that's a performance goal, which oftentimes is what we're going to be talking about here in esports contexts. So I thought maybe people who play Smash, well, okay, just in conversations with other Smashers I know, there's people who are known for choking, and there are people that are known for consistent play. And when I was doing a lot of background reading on expertise and skill acquisition, that seemed to be something that was missing from a lot of these theoretical models, right? These academic bigwigs are talking about practice and talent, but it's like, okay, but if you feel like crap, how are you going to practice? Or you know, if your mind is clouded from something or another, is your talent really going to shine through? So I wanted to look at that specifically in Smashers. So yeah, there's a lot of emotions that we experience over the course of a tournament, right? performance anxiety. Oh no, am I going to be on stream? Are my friends going to see me lose against this number one player from Ohio or whatever? And we experience many emotions over the course of a tournament. Could be nervousness about your performance. It could be just like maintaining your performance over the course of an entire tournament weekend. That's kind of challenging if you have 3 days of competition, right? And yeah, so my theory was emotion regulation probably also has something to do with tournament performance, not just practice, not talent, whatever. So I asked about 300 smashers, tell me how much you've played this game, tell me how good you think you are at these different parts of gaming, and how good you are at emotion regulation included in that list of things. And what I really found surprising was emotion regulation seems to be, in people's minds, a separate skill from tech skill, sensory motor, or cognitive skill, predicting what your opponent reads, all of that. All of those things people seem to think of as one thing, but when it comes to emotions, when it comes to how do you handle when the crowd starts booing you, how do you manage your performance anxiety, those things are factored differently statistically as a concept. So generally speaking, I think that's really important to know for anybody in gaming, like realizing that your emotions may or may not, or may have an impact on you, how you play. Not just the chokers, even the people who are trying to be consistent throughout time, like that's something everyone benefits from knowing. But what I found interesting was when I looked at these self-ratings of emotion regulation, when I asked people how good are you at managing your anxiety, all of that, I found an interesting pattern. So the top 100 players who did my study, which was like 36 or 40 of them even, they consistently rated themselves really good on emotion regulation. And you know what? It could be that they are. Maybe that's part of what supported them coming to the top 100, right? But another thing that's interesting is that they, over the course of a tournament, if I ask them after every match, how anxious are you right now? They just have really low levels of anxiety the whole tournament. So there could be something about being a top player where you're just not, you already have this confidence, you already have this past performance beefing you up that you don't have, you don't perceive threat in the environment, and therefore you don't experience anxiety, right? That could be one thing happening with top 100. What makes me think that that might be the case, especially, is when I look at gender minorities. So when I look at gender minority self-ratings of emotion regulation, they say they're really bad. They say, oh, performance anxiety gets to me all the time. I find it really hard to recover from my mistakes, or if my opponent outplays me, I find myself getting really salty. And that made me wonder, maybe it's not just how good you actually are at regulating your emotions. Maybe it's how much emotion you're experiencing over the course of a tournament, right? Because if these people are walking in and they are experiencing stereotype threat because they're a gender minority, they're going to have a bigger emotional burden. And they may perceive that as being, oh, I'm not good at this. I'm not good at regulating my emotions. A top 100 player gets to walk in, have very high confidence, doesn't have to regulate that much, thinks, oh yeah, I'm great at regulating, right? And what supports both of these, the thing that supports this interpretation is that I didn't just ask people how good are you at regulating in the game. I asked them across your life, which of these strategies do you apply to your everyday life, whether it's a romantic breakup or a tragedy in the family or Starbucks gets your drink wrong. What strategies do you use to regulate your emotions? And the self-ratings of game emotion regulation do not correlate with the general life emotion regulation. So I think players are thinking of their emotions differently in the performance context than they do in a general context. I think players are aware that they're experiencing different levels of anxiety or other emotion in a tournament, and that doesn't necessarily reflect their ability to cope. So, if we're all racing across the room and we have a glass of water, right? If somebody's glass is up at the tippy top, they're not going to be able to go as quick. If somebody's glass is barely full, they could sprint. And that's how I see emotion regulation or emotional experiences impacting the tournament performance in difference by, gender identity as one example.
Thank you so much for this expansive idea or explanation of what the potential of emotional regulation is. I'll just go ahead and read this quote. So that's on page 33. that relates to the potential of emotion regulation for women and gender minorities, for example. Educating players that emotion regulation is a process involving both an environmentally elicited reaction as well as cognitive regulation of that reaction could protect against the effects of over-arousal, like choking under pressure. So there we are with choking. For example, gender minority players may report higher threat or pressure in the esports environment compared to male peers. Acknowledging that different life experiences lead to different threat appraisal could validate gender minority players and prevent the maladaptive regulation strategy of self-blame. Rather than a personal failing, their anxiety reflects a threat appraisal process that is normal, and furthermore, cognitive regulation of the threat is within their control. So I think that's also a very practical idea how we could try and implement emotion regulation into working with players, for example, and working at events and actually educating people about how we handle emotions, because at the end of the day, that's our goal is to reach a more inclusive, more a safer community for all of us. And I think, yeah, that was the original point why I asked. So, what do you? I was wondering, could you expand a little bit about what the advantage of emotion regulation and educating about emotion regulation would be for non-gender minorities, for men in that case?
Mhm. So one thing that I found, not just in this study, but other studies as well, is that a lot of the socializing we do of young men is telling them the only emotion that is okay to express is anger. So, raging after a game, getting salty, being toxic even, all of those things are kind of boys being boys. So socially sanctioned expressions of emotion. And so there are some people who think that being angry is one way to be motivated in games. But what I'm finding in my research is that you're already motivated if you're walking into a tournament and you care about your results. And actually leaning into that anger can push you over a threshold of performance. So basically overwhelming your system's ability to play the game at your optimal level. So we could picture performance and emotion as being like a curve, right? And there's some ideal amount of emotion and energy you want to be experiencing before it's so overwhelming that it reduces your performance, right? So I'd say anyone should be aware that that knowing where you are emotionally is really important, and then knowing what you can do to push yourself up to get yourself more hyped, or to push yourself down, calm down a little bit. Don't let the handshaking or the sweating or the salt overshadow your skill, basically. Also, just knowing how to nudge yourself a little more positive or negative. I'm not sure why anyone would want to nudge negative, but theoretically, just being aware of your emotional state impacts you physiologically, which impacts your actual ability to play the game. I think that a lot of people tell men, you don't need to feel things, just ignore it. But what I'm saying is, no, you need to know what you're feeling all the time, and that is the only way that you can actually use your emotion to bolster your performance instead of interfering with it.
That's also one reason why I ask is because I do think that for a change in the culture of how we interact and communicate with each other, for that it's necessary that all of us participate, including someone as myself who is in a very privileged position. But I think the findings that you have, they are so relevant for all of us, and I want to actively think about how I also change my behavior, because that influences directly how the rest of our community, if I'm at an event, how we behave towards one another. And I think Spoopy also talked about last week about being mindful of what happens internally with us. So I think keeping track of that emotion and being aware of it and learning new ways how to handle them, I think is so crucial. And that's why I also wanted to ask you about that, because I do think that your thesis offers so much in all of in going into all of these directions. So um, thank you so much for answering that as well. I think despite these technical difficulties, we will start to wrap things up. I will try to recap some of the things that we talked about. So we started out by talking about what kinds of differences there are and how they impact our performances depending on um, not natural gender-based differences, but social and cultural forces that create gender-based differences. And with your empirical studies, you've proven that it is possible to think about these things, and that the data is there to back up new approaches, how we deal with emotions, for example, how we think about anxiety, how we can account for different levels of anxiety depending on what the background of a person or a player is, and that it's important to keep these things in mind. And also the importance of, besides emotion regulation, the importance and potential of women only spaces or events that can be used to build up resources, emotional resources, motivational resources. Um, and I think going forward, this all of these things are interrelated. The discourse is interrelated with how we actually feel in certain situations, how what amount of resources we want to dedicate to these topics, and how we want to think about emotions in ourselves. So, and yeah, I think that's been really insightful, and I would like to ask you whether you would add something to that.
I mean, that's a pretty good summary. I think I guess I would add just a general thought that I used to be one of those people that thought what I feel doesn't matter. I just need to focus on how I perform. But the more I studied the brain and the more I studied human hormone and endocrinology, the more I realized actually those things are inseparable. It's not just something you can brush off or pretend isn't there. And that was really validating in the end. You know? So I think it's important for us to all realize, like, psychologically speaking, what our body is experiencing and what we're capable of doing in game are inextricably linked. And we need to respect the different experiences people have and support skill acquisition generally. I think it'll let us reach higher levels of game, of play, of learning, to to acknowledge what we're experiencing, and remember that it impacts everything we do.
Those are really great closing remarks. I'm really thankful that we were able to wrap this up so elegantly. And I really want to thank you again for coming on and also bearing with me through the technical difficulties. For everyone who's still watching the stream, I can assure you that the video will be uploaded to YouTube, so you'll have the chance to rewatch our conversation, which I really greatly enjoyed. So thanks so much. I hope to see you around and possibly talk again. And all the best with your future research. I'm looking forward to hearing more about it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, everyone. Goodbye, and see you soon again on Tisk Talks. Bye bye.